Did you know there are people in your organization who have a superpower? Did you know that no one knows who they are? And consequently, you're not getting the best from all of your employees. What is this superpower? Well, it's Asperger's syndrome. And my name is Andrew Marsh, and I'm a superhero because I have Asperger's syndrome. And I'm going to share with you today why you should be engaging with your Asperger's superheroes for the benefit of your business and your employees. I'm going to share three things with you today. Firstly, what is Asperger's syndrome? I think it would be good to know what it is. Secondly, why you should employ people who have Asperger's syndrome. And thirdly, how to engage with your superheroes. I'm going to start off with a definition, which if you won't mind, I'd like to read because I want to make sure I get this right. This is the definition of Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum disorder, one of a distinct group of complex neurodevelopment disorders characterized by social impairment, communication difficulties, and restrictive, repetitive, and stereotypical patterns of behavior. Now, if you were an employer and that was your first experience of Asperger's syndrome, you wouldn't be sitting there right now thinking, I need to employ these people, they're just who I need. I don't like that definition. It uses the word disorder twice, and it doesn't say anything about the person or their abilities. It's very clinical, and I don't like that particular definition. I prefer to use the word condition, and I'm going to come back to this later on in my talk. Everyone on the spectrum is different. We have a multitude of facets and traits, and it is not just a straight linear from 1 to 100. Where are we? Over that side. 1 to 100, and that's it. If I was to take this kebab skewer, which hopefully you can see, if you imagine the blunt end is 0% and the sharp end is 100%, and I was to shove this kebab skewer through a grapefruit, and I would sit somewhere on that from 0 to 100%. Now imagine if there were 100 kebab skewers through that grapefruit, or 1,000. And every single trait or characteristic of someone with Asperger's sat them differently on every different skewer through that grapefruit. That might give you an idea of the breadth of the spectrum of people who have Asperger's syndrome. It's often said that when you've met one person with Asperger's syndrome, you've met one person with Asperger's syndrome. And by that, what I mean is you haven't met everyone, because everyone's traits and characteristics are completely different. Some will be better at some things, some will be better at other things, and some will thrive in an area that I am not particularly good at. So it's very important to understand that as a spectrum, we are all completely different and unique, just like all of you are, the neurotypical people. One of the difficulties I have, and many people with Asperger's syndrome have, is having a brain that is going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. My brain is non-stop. It's going all the time. And it's not just focusing on one thing. It's having lots of things going on in my head all the time. Rather like having a computer with 20 tabs open, but each of those 20 tabs is vying for your attention. So when we're doing something, when we're at work or when we're doing something that we enjoy, we have to absolutely focus really hard on that one thing we're doing to try and get rid of all the clutter and the noise and the light and the circumstances that are going on around us of everyday life in a work or a social situation. We really have to focus hard on that one thing we're doing to be able to do it. Otherwise, we will just be lost in a melange of noise and everything else going on around us. To try and give you some perspective of that, if you were to be sitting at a desk and there were 3 people in front of you having a reasonable conversation, you might be able to focus on what you were doing. Imagine if there were 15 people standing in front of your desk having 5 different conversations at different volumes. You might find it much more difficult to focus on the thing you are doing. And again, imagine if there were 30 people or 50 people having 35, 40 different conversations. It's going to be so difficult for you to focus and concentrate on what it is you're doing that you will get nowhere. You will get nothing done. One of the difficulties we have is fitting in. As you heard from that horrible clinical definition, we have certain characteristics of behavior And one of the problems that manifests to us is fitting in. I've always felt apart from society rather than a part of it. One word rather than two. And we find it difficult to fit in and get along with people because we don't understand the social niceties and the unwritten rules that go on in society as about what is acceptable behavior and how to interact with other people. We really struggle to fit in and contribute and be part of what is going on around us. That means we're quite often quite introverted. You might think that's strange for me wanting to stand or sit here and speak to you today, but most of us are quite introverted. So we might be the quiet ones in the corner until you get us talking or invite us to talk about the thing that they really are interested in. And then we will talk and talk and talk without realizing the social niceties that we are hogging the conversation. We might get quite animated, quite loud, and that in itself can create problems with being around other people. It could be anything. It could be Star Trek, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Pokemon, and I'm going to come back to Pokemon a little later on in my talk. But there will be something that we all have that is the one thing that we want to do when we're not at work. The thing that drives us, the thing that really makes us want to do. Some people might be riding their motorbike or being mechanical, but we all have something that we love to do and we enjoy doing. When we're given the opportunity to talk about that, we will go on and on without realizing, as I said there, that other people might want to get in on the conversation. So we find it difficult to be in company around other people. And one of my great difficulties is walking into a room full of people and trying to be part of it. In networking that I'm doing, with setting up my business, one of the things that before we had COVID was to go to networking meetings, and there would be 30 or 50 people in the room in groups of 2 and 3, all having little different conversations. And I wouldn't know how to go about starting up a conversation. I was always brought up to believe that interrupting someone when they're having a conversation was rude. And I quite often got chastised for butting in with people. So I would be standing in this background trying to find someone who's on their own that I could then try and strike up a conversation with, or trying to fit in with what's going on around me. It's very difficult. One of the problems I had as a child was I was constantly told to sit down, shut up, and be quiet. And that was in family company. Can you imagine that as an 8-year-old being told to sit down, shut up, and be quiet? I would much rather be out in the hall playing with my toy cars and my Lego than being in the lounge with my aunts and uncles and cousins and brothers and grandparents. Because I know that if someone was making a noise in that room and a parent or a grandparent came in, the one person they would pick out would be me. I would be the one that was perceived to be making the noise, and I would be given that magical phrase. And that was through the mantra that I lived in family company until I left home at 18. So we find it difficult getting on and fitting in with people. But we are quite nice people, really, when you get to know us. So we find it difficulty with the social niceties, and particularly with people not saying what they mean and not meaning what they say. We really struggle with taking things very literally. We can fall prey to little jokes that people will play on others when they know that they're having a joke played on them, and they either go along with it or they don't. We won't get that. We will think that that's serious or that is what's supposed to happen, and we will get caught out with the joke. It's something that I tend to get caught out with things like that. I haven't quite fallen for the long stand, but those are the sorts of things that I do get caught out with from time to time. Just have a quick drink of water. That's a little bit about what Asperger's syndrome is and how it relates to me. I'm going to share with you a little bit about why it's good to employ people with Asperger's syndrome. I'm going to mention 2 names to you: Andy Warhol, Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in his 70s. He always knew he was different, but didn't know why, rather like myself. I always knew I was different, but I didn't know why until I got my diagnosis. But there's others of us in society and in the world and throughout history that many people believe had Asperger's syndrome. People like Einstein, Nikola Tesla, Newton, Mozart, Beethoven, people like that, who people would think they were different. They thought differently. They thought out of the box. They came up with new ways of doing something, or came up with fantastic things that have given us great pleasure and moved us on as a society. Someone else I want to mention, Steve Jobs. Can you all see this? This is a Nokia 6500 telephone, mobile phone. He looked at something like this and went, I can make more than just that phone. I don't see this as just a phone. I can enable that with the internet to change the way we communicate with each other. And he came up with something like this, the iPhone. He didn't just see a phone as a device to pick up and say, hello, how are you doing? He saw it as a way to communicate with the rest of the world and how we communicate as a society with each other. And he changed the way overnight with one device, how we see the world, because he thought differently about what can this do? What can we put together? What can we make better and different from what we already know that we have? Truly amazing what he did. A little bit about Alan Turing. I'm sure many of you know who Alan Turing was. He was the gifted man who worked at Bletchley Park during World War II. He broke the Enigma code machines from the German U-boats. He did it by pretty much inventing the first computer that, as we would understand it, to break the codes so that we understood what was happening with the U-boats in the North Atlantic and elsewhere. He did it because he thought about something in a different way, rather than conventional. What can I make that will help us solve this problem? And he came up with these machines that did that. Truly amazing. I mentioned earlier on about Pokemon. I'm going to look over here to mention the gentleman's name because I can never quite get it right. Satoshi Tajiri, the Japanese man, and he was diagnosed with autism when he was about 6 or 8 years old. He had two great loves at that age. One was insects, and he was fascinated with insects and collected them. And the second was drawing little cartoon characters. He then discovered computing and gaming, and he thought, my cartoon characters, computing and gaming, and just like Steve Jobs, when he put the phone and the internet together, he put the two together and created Pokemon, which is a global sensation of cartoon characters. And he invented that because he thought differently. How can I do more than what we know we can do at the moment? How can we combine that, my cartoon sketches and colors that I made, with a gaming device? And he put the two together and created Pokemon. Quite extraordinary what he did. So those people that I've mentioned, they have unique problem-solving skills, and they look at things in a different way. Einstein and Newton particularly changed the way we think about mathematics and physics. I'm going to mention one more person to you before I move on to something else. Leonardo da Vinci, not just a fantastic artist, but he was an architect, he was a designer, he was an engineer. He came up with something that we would call a helicopter today in the 16th century. He was hundreds of years ahead of his time with how he saw things differently. Truly amazing what he can do. And so what I want to get across to you today is to make you aware that people with Asperger's syndrome have unique problem-solving skills. They have amazing ways of coming up with new ideas, new products, new processes, new ways of doing something that can be more efficient and can drive your business forward. Wouldn't it be there's an IT technical company in Scotland called Auticon, and they go out of their way to employ, as their technical people, their computer experts, the software experts, they go out of their way to employ autistic and people with Asperger's in their company. Around 80% of their technical staff are on the spectrum because they are so good at what they do with the technology that is at their disposal. So they are, and wouldn't it be fantastic if everyone on the spectrum was valued and rewarded like that company does? It would be amazing, and what it could do, not only for the well-being and the sense of worth of that person, but what it could do for driving your business forward as we go into the we're nearly at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. Can you believe? That's quite amazing. I'm quite often asked, where would you put someone with Asperger's syndrome in a business? That's kind of a tricky question, because it depends on the strength of that person on the spectrum, and the nature of your business. But say, for example, you're a manufacturer, an engineering manufacturer. One of the best places to put them to suit their skills would be in your research and development team. Give them the opportunity to think of the what if questions, just like Steve Jobs. What if I put these two things together? Just like Satoru Tajiki, putting two things together, cartoons and gaming. What can they do? What can we combine? What can we come up with that's different, that's new, that's innovative? Give them the freedom to express themselves and free think about the way they see things three-dimensionally. Quite a lot of people on the spectrum see things in three dimensions, which is why they're very good at architectural and engineering design. So they have a lot of skills and a lot of abilities. A lot of people just aren't gainfully employed, or if they are employed, they're underutilized. And how much better it would be if we could all be gainfully employed and valued at where we were. One of my particular skills was being very organized. I used to be a geologist in the construction industry. And one day I came into work and there's a big box of reports on my desk. And my boss said, we've just got this job in. Can you go through all these reports, fathom out what we've got so that we can make a start on this project? I said, no problem. Went through it. I laid them all out on the desk. There were different types of reports. There were factual, there was interpretive, there was legal, there was technical data, historical data, all sorts of different reports. I gave them all a unique reference number, and I set it all out on a sheet of A3 paper. This was in the mid-1990s, by the way, and that's relevant. And it was only very many years later when I started using computers at work that what I'd actually done is I realized that I'd made a spreadsheet before I actually knew what one was. Now, I'm not claiming that I've invented the spreadsheet, far from it, but that's how I would set out information now, work in business, using a spreadsheet to present information in an easily imagined way that people can see it and understand what's going on. So one of the other things that I particularly enjoyed doing was detailed technical work, such as slope stability calculations. There's motorways between Ecclefechan and Kirkpatrick and Gretna, which is just down in the borders in Scotland, where I've done quite a lot of the soil and rock slope stability designs down there. And one of the exciting things that I got from it was breaking down the slope stability calculation, which is quite a long technical calculation with lots of different parameters, all having different impact on the outcome and the factor of safety, as we would call it. So I was able to break that down into its component parts so that I could do a sensitivity analysis on, if I change this parameter, how does it affect the stability? Groundwater was one of the important factors. Depending on where the groundwater was, made a huge difference on the stability of a slope. I was able to do that because I could see how I could break the calculation down and use it as a spreadsheet. So these are some of the things that people on the spectrum can do. One of the other things I have with order is sorting out books and files, and I was quite often given a bunch of files and say, can you sort out what we've got in that? And it might seem a fairly trivial thing to do, but organizing your files so you know what's in all the tabs, what's in each file, what's in all the boxes, and having a system where someone else could come in and say, here's the notes, this is how it works. They could easily find what they're looking for, rather than, as I'm sure we've all done from time to time, standing there looking at all this information thinking, where's that one piece of paper I need? I enjoyed organizing data and files, correspondence files, calculations files, so that everyone knew where they were, so that if I wasn't there, someone could go to the system and know exactly where they could pick up what it is they were looking for. One of the other areas where people with Asperger's syndrome are good at is in financial fraud investigation, because some of them are particularly good at picking out patterns in numbers. So looking at a whole range of numbers, and they can see patterns in the numbers and see whether that's financial fraud investigation or someone's been doing insider trading or credit card fraud. They're particularly good at that because of the way they can see things three-dimensionally, as I said earlier. And so they're particularly good at those sorts of applications. Again, it depends on the person and it depends on the business. Have another quick drink of water. I want to share with you some of the techniques that I go through with employers when I'm with them on how to get the best out of the people with Asperger's syndrome. There's a lot of techniques to be employed, but I'd like to share 3 of the key ones with you today. First one is the brief. It might sound very straightforward and obvious, but to actually sitting down with someone when you've got a new piece of work, spending that hour with them, going through what is required to sit down in a space away from the hustle and bustle of what's going on in the office, find a meeting room, have a cup of tea, sit down and go through step by step what you want them to do, who they're going to report to, if there's other team members, if there's technical software or computer applications to do. Set all of this out in a very logical and methodical way and have a checklist and go through each point on your checklist methodically, one by one. You have to, obviously, with any task that you're given, the person being given the task will have questions that they want to ask. And this is where you need to allow for a silence. They're not ignoring you. They're thinking and they're processing with their mind going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. They're processing all the information that you've given them. And they're thinking about what questions they want to ask. And so they might be sit there. You might say, have you got any questions? And they'll sit there and they won't say anything. That's not a bad sign. It's because they're thinking, and then they will come up with their questions. Be prepared for anything because they could come up with some really insightful questions. The second technique I want to share with you is something that I call the safe space. And it is what it sounds like. Quite often, people on the spectrum can get overwhelmed by noise, light, the chitter chatter of what's going around the office, even someone typing hard on a computer and click, 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 click. Those sorts of things, or the texture of when they walk along the carpet or a vinyl flooring, can set them on edge. And so there may come times during the workday where they think, oh, this is getting too much for me. I need to get away. Because if they don't get away, then if someone interrupts them or something happens, you could get an escalation of something. Someone could say something out of turn, or they could be quite vocal, and you could have an incident with another member of staff or a client. So allowing them to have a safe space where they can go, grab a cup of tea, sit down for 5 or 10 minutes, do some gentle breathing exercises, and relax. Calm down, take themselves out of the situation. And then when they're ready, doesn't need to be long, 5 or 10 minutes, they can go back to work, ready and able to continue with their work. There's obviously a couple of important points to consider when doing that. Is one, someone needs to know where they've gone. So you should agree a signal before they go there. Not every time, but I mean, you should agree with them with the signal that they're going to use. It may just be something simple as putting their stapler or their hole punch in the middle of their desk, which means that when the boss comes out and sees, oh, he's not there, but there's his hole punch, he's gone to his safe space, or they've gone to the safe space, I know where they are. So in the event of an evacuation for a fire or something like that, and if they don't turn up at the evacuation point, you know where they are, so that when it's safe, someone can go and look for them, the right person can go and look for them and get them to safety. So there is a little health and safety thing. But the really important thing about the safe space is they don't need permission every time they need to go. If you're at the point of overwhelm, the last thing you need to do is to have to go and chap on the boss's door and say, I need to go, boss, when they possibly could be the person that's causing them the problem in the first place, or the boss is really busy and they get, oh, for heaven's sake, and they get agitated and they shout, or they have an incident with the person. You've got to trust them to come back to work, make up the time, but the safe space is a really important place where they can get away from what's going on around them, come back, focus, and get on with work. The third one is feedback. Just like the brief where you set out what you're going to do, you should have feedback at the end of a project to go through what went well, what didn't go so well, how we can improve for the next time that we do something else. So again, the feedback should be a conversation, a two-way conversation between the boss and the person with Asperger's syndrome, so that they understand what went well, how they got on, and how it could be improved. The really important thing is to let the person on the spectrum have their say as well. So it's not just me telling you, the person has to then communicate with their boss, well, this went particularly well. I had a problem communicating with this person. I didn't get on with that. That was a glitch that held things up, or some other thing. And it may be that some of their feedback needs to get escalated back up the chain of command, higher up the hierarchy in the business. That might be more important things that could deal with at a higher level. But it's really important to have that two-way conversation with the employee and the boss when something is finished. Sadly, not all of these steps are taken. And you would think that the brief and the feedback is something that should happen in most businesses. Unfortunately, I've worked in the construction industry for 23 years, and I don't see that all the time. I see people who are working for bosses and supervisors, and they're not given the inspiration, or they're not given the encouragement to go on and do the task and to express themselves in their own way. They have dictatorial bosses who don't convey and don't instill an atmosphere of wanting to work, which is a great shame. On the other hand, I've worked for some fantastic engineers and bosses who are brilliant at managing people like that. It could just be that some people aren't given the training as to how to manage people. And again, that might seem quite a strange thing to say, that managers aren't trained to be managers. But in a lot of places, they're not. There's an assumption that after a certain length of time, they're assumed to be able to know how to manage others. And that isn't always the case. Earlier on, I gave you a 30-word definition, a clinical definition of Asperger's syndrome. I've got my own definition that I think is far more appropriate. I'd like to share that with you now. These are my words. Asperger's syndrome is an autism spectrum condition characterized by unique problem-solving skills, a highly developed imagination, and a flair for innovation in design, engineering, science, computing, and the arts. Now, if that was your first experience of what someone with Asperger's syndrome is capable of, you might think, I need to talk to these people. These are the sorts of people that can drive my business forward and be great for my business. So it is how you look at it. Everything is how you look at it in life. And I tend to look for the positives in people with Asperger's syndrome because of their unique problem-solving skills. And they're pioneers. They're coming up with new innovative ways of doing something, new product, new process, and the like. So instead of focusing on the label, let's focus on what they are able to do. Thank you.
Very good.
Excellent.
Very good. Excellent.
Thank you, Andrew. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Andrew from the members? Alistair? Alistair, you're muted.
Andrew,
Ian, can you unmute Alistair? I don't know whether
he'll have to do it himself.
There we are, right. So I'm unmuted. Andrew, tell us, how did you get your diagnosis made?
Okay. I was in some therapy with in group therapy for other health conditions I had, and the person who was organising that was a clinical psychologist. And having got to know him over the course of about 12 weeks, I said to him one day, "Can you diagnose people with Asperger's syndrome?" He says, "I've been trained to, but it's not what I do. I branched off into other areas of the field. But I've noticed you do this, this, and this. So if you would like, I can email your GP and let him know that it's something that should be explored," which was incredibly kind of him. So I had a conversation with my GP. We did a bit of exchange of emails, and he said, "Yeah, okay, I think there's merit in referring you to the adult autism team, which is in Clydebank." And they took a look at what was said from my GP and said, "It's worth exploring. Let's come in and have a chat." And basically 3 one-hour interviews with myself and my wife and them, and they said, "Yeah, you have Asperger's syndrome." So that's how I got my diagnosis. Yeah, made an awful lot of sense of an awful lot of things.
Ruth?
Thank you for that talk, Andrew. I really learned a lot from it. Do you think it would have helped you if you had known at a much younger age?
Absolutely.
If you were having to deal with this?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I try to encourage is that when I give talks like this, if I have an impact on one person who might think either themselves or their child or their grandchild has behaves a little bit differently around others, that person then can get assessed and get the proper diagnosis. They will get the support from their family. And now with schools being more aware, having to be more aware that this condition is something that affects about 1% of the population, although that's possibly getting on to being 1.5 to maybe 2% of the population in young people, that they can get the support and the understanding from the schools and from their parents at home, friends at home. Yeah, I think it would have made a great difference. It would have changed what I've done and what my career was and all of those things. So that would have been a different life I would have led, but it would have been, I think it would have been more beneficial to get on. I was badly bullied throughout school and work, and I didn't mention it in my talk, but yeah, some of the bullying was not just bullying; it was abuse. It was quite severe. So if the understanding from those around me, teachers and lecturers at college, could have taken that away, then it would have been a different, happier life. Yeah, definitely. So if you know someone who has or thinks they might be on the spectrum, or their behavior is slightly different around others, I would encourage you to speak to their GP, or ask them to speak to their GP, their parents, and see whether it's something to be explored. I would definitely encourage that. Yes.
Andrew, it's not hereditary, I take it.
Oh, the short answer, Niall, is I don't know the answer to that. I think there is an element of that to a point. I don't think they particularly know. There are certain environmental factors and conditions that can tend to lead to it. Some people do get it passed down, some people don't. My mother didn't have it, but she may have had other mental health issues which manifested in me as Asperger's, but manifested in her in a different way. So that's a tough one to answer, to be honest with you. But I think if it was all hereditary, then most of us would have it. I think because with the way that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions for Andrew?
Yes,
John?
President, there's an inference in both the question and in the answer that it's a very difficult thing to diagnose. Could either party or anyone else confirm that?
Well, if you get referred to the right team, it is not particularly difficult. The adult autism team are specialists in diagnosing adults and for autism. So that is what they do. That is their job day in, day out. So they know the traits, they know the characteristics, they know the questions, and they know the probing questions to ask of the person. And also, it's important to have someone with you that knows you, which is why my wife came with me for 2 of the interviews, because they might ask me a question and say, "Oh no, I don't do that," and she's sitting there going, "Oh yes, he does," and then gives examples. And so that verification is part of the process. But I think some of the trouble might be getting referral from your GP to the right team. I think that can be some of the difficulties that people have. But be persistent. And there are Scottish Autism and the National Autistic Society. If you are concerned about someone who might be on the spectrum and they're not getting the support from their GPs, you could contact them and they might be able to help you and give them a nudge in certain directions. So there are ways and means to do it. I think, as with all things, you need to be persistent if you don't get the answer that you think you should get at the first stage.
Femi?
Morag?
Yes, could I ask a question? You mentioned at the beginning of your talk about a company that actually employs people with Asperger's. Could you give me the name of that again? My godson's son has been diagnosed with Asperger's. He's a very bright boy. He's now 20. He hasn't worked. He's excellent on computers, etc. Just be interesting to know the name of the company.
It's Auticon. AUTICON.
Thank you.
They're an IT/software computing company. If you just look Auticon Scotland on the Google, I'm sure you will find it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
George?
No,
Just
Femi is
to-
wanting to speak.
Yeah.
Pardon, Ian?
Femi,
Femi?
Okay, I just want to ask if this can be, in some cases, be confused with ADHD, that's the attention deficiency disorder. Can it sometimes be confused with it?
Yes, there is an overlap between some characteristics of Asperger's and autism and some characteristics of ADHD. And as I say, it's like a Venn diagram. The two circles overlap each other, and there can be misdiagnosis from one to the other. And it's quite. I probably have some OCD in me that hasn't been diagnosed because of the way that I like everything organized in my files and my boxes and my CDs and my DVDs and my books, everything all lined up like soldiers. And and I would know if someone's been into my room and borrowed a book. I would just have to look, cast a glance around the room. So there may be some OCD in there. And yes, that there are some characteristics, and there can be misdiagnosis between the two with ADHD and ADD as well.
Thank you very much.
I was just thinking, Andrew, if you, how is your drinks cabinet? Would you know if someone has taken a bottle of ABC?
Absolutely. Someone's touched my whiskey. Who's the culprit?
Oh, that would be Niall if he was in your house.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any more questions for Andrew? No. I'd now like to pass the vote of thanks on to Alistair.
Hello, Andrew. I'd like on Rotary's behalf to thank you for your talk and giving a great personal insight into growing up with ASD, you call it, don't you? And the challenges you faced in your personal and professional life. And thank you for answering the question so well as well. And we can actually see why you are the PSA Scotland Speaker winner last year. So thank you once again for your excellent talk.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Well done.
Well done, Andrew. Our speaker next week